Right. So welcome to the July 2023 vacation edition of the office hours. We have our very own Mike Burgee here to talk about creating a DevOps pipeline. And although it's not a technical, how to as far as like a script or something, it's certainly important on systems that are mission critical and need a systematic process to get features put into their main production without editing the production, I imagine. So without further ado, Mike Burgee, you are on the clock.
Thanks. All right. Hi, everyone. Hope your July is going well. So today we're going to talk about DevOps and specifically a pipeline. So we'll go ahead and get started here. All right. So first off, there's a lot of there's going to be a lot of acronyms and catchphrases in this session. Probably stuff you're all familiar with from hearing it before from developing custom software, but maybe not. So we'll kind of review things off. So first off, what are DevOps? DevOps, obviously, combination of development and operations. Um, and the initial idea behind DevOps is to bring those two things together in your business. Historically, these two teams, the developers on the operations side of things, kind of worked separately in their own separate silos. Um, Developers coded and built the software, and then the operations side of things ran the QA, the testing, working on deploying that, and then actually posting that out to people. And this causes difficulties when those two teams are not communicating with each other or properly working with each other. Things start to go wrong. So the idea behind DevOps is that you're bringing development and operations together um, in order to basically have a better experience with the software that is being built for your business. So SDLC, I might have mentioned this in here. SDLC is the software development lifecycle. That's pretty much the journey that some projects go from concept to completion. But as I'll talk to a little bit later, a good DevOps pipeline is kind of shaped in a circle, and that's what we do for our continuous improvement lifecycle here at Mainspring as well. Is we're always thinking of what's next. We're not looking for ever completing a project, because as soon as you complete a project, something is going to change traditionally in your technology stack. There's going to be a new feature that's available. There's going to be a better way to do something, and having that pipeline, that circle of thinking about ideas, making those ideas happen, testing, and then going back to the beginning and repeating that process over and over again. That's the life cycle we're talking about for SDLC. All right. What is a pipeline specifically then? Because that sounds like maybe that's just a one-way journey. And to a point, it is. But that journey, again, it's pipeline, but it's in a circle. So you're always going back to the same starting point. But a pipeline is a combination of automation steps, tools, and best practices across the entire SDLC. And this is designed to facilitate both the development side, the dev side, and the deployment side, the ops side of software, and getting it into the hands of your end users. Most critical when thinking about a pipeline is there is no one size fits all approach to this. Every business is going to be different. On the FileMaker platform and at Mainspring, we've had the opportunity to work with businesses of one, or businesses of 100, or businesses of 1,000. So each one of those types of environments are going to have their own development pipeline that works very well for them, but might not um, be good for like a single person deployment or a small business of 5 users. So really what we're trying to talk about here with DevOps pipelines is what steps can you take out of everything presented today. What ideas, what tools, what processes can you take out of this life cycle and adapt to your business to create something that works? And the whole point about doing this is to get very robust software and get your updates done and your software developed as fast as you can. So some important concepts for any successful DevOps pipeline. Um, Most are going to include automation in some format, continuous integration, continuous deployment, automated testing, reporting, and monitoring. We're going to cover each one of these concepts broken up a little bit extra down into smaller parts here in a bit. But the idea behind DevOps pipeline is that it's something that should be repeatable and always on and continuous. It's always part of the process of how you are developing software. Nothing should kind of be outside of the pipeline, because if you start doing stuff outside of the pipeline, you lose the benefit of that. And again, the larger your system gets over time, the better the better security that you'll have over time of knowing that if you're doing repeated testing or if you're doing deployments at a specific interval, you're going to have the security around your application for that stuff that's set in stone rather than being unsure. Talking to your developer and saying, "When are we going to get your software?" And your developer says, "I don't know." We try to never have an "I don't know" answer to a question. We always try to have answers to questions for people when we are the ones managing that pipeline. So, and then what are the benefits aside from what I mentioned already? Um, it's basically the main benefit is it's designed to organize you so you can quickly build, test, and deliver software to your users. That's the main benefit. That might be broken down into some smaller benefits like faster software delivery, um, more reliable and higher quality software, rather than just jumping in and piecing bits together. Things are going through a process of getting tested and checked out, and that leads to higher quality software. And that higher quality software offers reduced risk, like I was mentioning before. Risk could be anything such as like a botched deployment where you go to deploy software and something doesn't work and now you have to go back and fix it and redeploy it. Or maybe there's some process that's very messed up, like a data migration where it goes wrong and now you've lost some data and you need to go roll over to a backup. That's the risk that we're talking about that's mitigated with a pipeline. Any automation that you can do, obviously repeatable automation reduces the number of man hours that you have to spend on your project. So for
Hey,
things
hey,
like,
Mike, I
yeah,
hate to interrupt, but are you advancing slides? Because it looks like your PowerPoint is flashing, but you're still on Intro to DevOps.
no, I'm on Intro to DevOps still.
Oh,
It's
are,
flashing because people keep joining the meeting and jumping off, and every time that happens,
oh,
Teams is flashing the screen for some reason.
you got it. Okay.
Yeah, almost done with this slide though. Um, so yeah, automation will kind of streamline things and allow you to trim off hours off your project, so that makes it cheaper in the long run. So if you adapt a pipeline early on, it has that benefit as well. And then lastly, the last benefit I can think of right off the top of my head is shorter review times. So that means that as you adopt your pipeline, with each release, the amount of time it takes to develop and deploy each release gets streamlined and gets faster, which means that ultimately, your software is going to get built faster than it was if you weren't using any sort of pipeline tool. And that can lead to faster resolution times as well if you have problems that you need to take care of in the pipeline. All right, next slide. So talking about our continuous improvement initiative a little bit, we've focused our pipeline around Agile, and Agile methodology is a whole nother session on its own, but basically what we're trying to do is break very large chunks of work down into very small chunks of work. So if you have a to-do list that has 500 things on it that you want to do, we break it down into each little point on that 500 point checklist is its own thing to deal with and focus on. And then we'll plan for doing work in a smaller increment, such as 2 weeks, and we'll say, okay, in these 2 weeks we can do 6 things off this checklist. We'll go do those things. We'll finish those things. We'll make sure those things work, and everything is good to go before we go back and repeat that for the next 2-week cycle. And over the course of time, that allows you to adapt to changes. So if you start with a 500 point checklist, chances are at the conclusion of your project, only maybe 200 of those things on those checklists are still part of the project, and maybe another 200 of those things have changed and they're different now as you've gotten started. So the point of Agile is that you're flexible to adapt as the project proceeds. So our continuous improvement pipeline is built around that idea. And that is evaluated on a per client basis. So we guide the pipeline to have the right tools and the right fit for each project that we deal with. We might deal with a project that's only going to be like 25 hours, but we still use a pipeline to guide that, because if we get to the end of those 25 hours and there's another 10 hours to do, we already have the pipeline set up to handle those things. And the most important part of our initiative, of course, is total client control. There needs to be no mystery at all between us, the developers, and you, which is kind of the operation side of this, of what's going on, where's our timeline, what is our budget, how much is being spent. That's all stuff that leads to a lot of frustration in traditional projects, and that's why we no longer give quotes for what's called waterfall, which is kind of the opposite of Agile. Waterfall is like, I want you to build me Salesforce in FileMaker or something like that. And somebody will say, like, well, yeah, we can build you Salesforce in FileMaker. That's going to take 50,000 hours. Like, there's no way to accurately predict how much time it's going to take. And most of those projects wind up halfway through and they find out you don't need Salesforce, you need QuickBooks. So again, we give the client total control of knowing what's been budgeted, what's been approved, what's been estimated, where the progress is, and if there's ever a need to stop or adjust the process, you're not already on the hook for that whole 50,000 hour project. So that's kind of the guiding principles around our continuous improvement, which is, again, we've developed these processes and these tools as part of the pipeline we provide for the projects we do. So I'm going to share some of those tools with you as we talk about the stages of pipeline. Now, I borrowed this graphic from GitHub, so thanks to them for that. But this is essentially a pipeline, and you'll notice that it's in a continuous infinity symbol, not quite a circle. Could be a circle, but here it's presented in going into infinities, because again, if you're using custom software, you really should be nursing it along and maintaining it and doing updates every now and then to make it better, because for each incremental update, each update that you do gains some functionality, saves you time, automates tasks, makes your business better. So again, it's this continuous cycle that we'll talk about. So um, obviously, the planning stage is where the teams are going to meet and discuss what needs to be built. This could be um, an overall kickoff to a project, or it could just be planning what's going on in the next 2 weeks. But ultimately, the plan is to come up with an approved set of criteria that the dev team is then going to take and build, and that moves into the code stage. Coding is your average uh, putting things together, making things work. Building is kind of uh, taking that built code and compiling it together and turning it into an application that can be tested. The other thing to note is that if you're a FileMaker developer, some of this stuff is bridges multiple things. Like there might not be a separation between your release and your deployment. Those might be the same thing. I'm just kind of loosely explaining the concepts here. So building is taking that code and building an application out of it. That gets sent to testing. That after it gets tested, any bugs are patched, and the plan has been met essentially for that sprint. Then it becomes what's called an RC, a release candidate. So a release candidate is something that the dev team thinks is ready to deploy. We're ready to release this. So here you go, operations. You can go and deploy this. So operations will take that release candidate. They'll kind of do maybe some more testing on it, and then they'll go to deploy that. And deployment is when it gets into your users' hands. Your users take care of operating that. And then the operations team is also monitoring that operation. So that might involve some things like performance monitoring, providing feedback on the latest deployment, on the latest release. And then from there, it just goes back to the beginning. You go back to the planning stage, you plan the next iteration, the next sprint. So bringing these down into 1 week, 2 week, 3 week sprints, you can see I like to say it's like that retirement commercial where they have the big dominoes where you push the little domino at the beginning, and after 10 dominoes, it's this giant domino that falls over and makes a giant boom. It's the same thing with custom software. If you're building upon small increments like these sprints, eventually you wind up with a very highly customized, highly functional, very complex piece of custom software that will help you run your business. All right. Let's talk about the actual toolbox. These are getting into the things that we do for our software development pipeline. And again, keep in mind that it's about automating things. It's about getting tools together, and it's about getting processes together that people can use. So at our core for the agile projects and the continuous improvement we do is a place where we can break down that 500 point checklist into 500 individual things and then organize and work on those. And for that, we use Trello. Trello is a Kanban board app. It's basically allows you to create cards that represent things that you're going to build. It could be a very complex thing. That's what we call an epic. An epic could be something like, I want to build an invoicing module. And then we'll have separate cards that will break that down into individual things. Well, I need to be able to print an invoice, and I need to be able to create an invoice, and I need to be able to mark an invoice as paid. Those are all individual checklist items that we can check off. So our continuous improvement life cycle, our agile cycle, is based on columns in Trello that track the progress of each thing from conceptual to planning to now it's planned and ready to be worked on, and then it gets into the development cycle, and then it gets into the testing cycle and the review cycle, and then finally, once it reaches its way to the end of the columns on the right hand side, it'll be finished. So I'll show Trello in a little bit, but basically you'll need some sort of tool to manage manage your software pipeline. Because you can't really do DevOps unless you know what you're building. The dev team needs to have that organization, and the more tasks that you have, the harder it is to manage that thing. So we've found that Trello is very good for managing that and working with our process for breaking things down. Process documentation, that's pretty easy to come up with. Most people kind of skip this in FileMaker because it's so easy to figure out how to use FileMaker. But in terms of process documentation, it's just simply writing down what it is your software does. And this can be as easy as saying, we have an invoicing section. It has these capabilities: create invoice, print invoice, mark invoices paid. So by documenting that, the processes of what your software is doing, that becomes both a template for planning the work that needs to be done, and also that becomes documentation for users, and it becomes documentation for testing as well. So while most of the times it's cost prohibitive sometimes to do, if you don't have like an in-house team for handling this and you're just like hiring a consultant to do some developing for you, documentation might not be a part of that. But it's an important thing, part of the planning process to have. And our Trello cards, like I'll show you in a few minutes here, they become a part of that process documentation as well. And then the last two things for planning, obviously forecasting and budgeting. Forecasting is in the agile environment, it deals with how much work you have planned and what is your capacity and timeline. So when we get in one of our project planning meetings, we might have planned 60 hours of work. And we have a column in Trello that says we have 60 hours of work that's approved and ready to be worked on. So our project manager will say, okay, I've looked at our dev team calendar over the next 2 weeks, and I see that we have the capacity to do 30 hours over the next 2 weeks. So I'm going to forecast that it's going to take us 4 weeks in total, 2 sprints to get through 60 hours of work. So that allows us to put a timeline on cards. It allows us to set those items in stone on our calendar so that we know we're going to be working on that dedicated for the next 2 weeks, and then the sprint after that 4 weeks out. So we try to forecast. We have our solid forecast, which is our next week of work. So our dev team meets every Friday and we say, this is everything that we've got for the next week. And then our project managers are also doing forecasting beyond that to 2 to 4 weeks out. And you kind of don't want to forecast beyond that for Agile. And the reason is simply Agile is only supposed to look at the next 2 weeks or 2 sprints worth of work, because everything beyond that, things could change. So we don't want to be locked into stuff that we might not be doing 4 weeks down the line. And then budgeting comes out of that. It's just making sure I have these 60 hours. Are we approved to work on those 60 hours or not? And this is the same for consulting like us, or it's the same as working as an in-house developer. If you're running your own business or you only have one in-house developer that's supporting your company, that person is limited to 40 hours of work a week. So if you have 400 hours of work to do in your forecast, you're going to have to decide what's the most important, and that's budgeting. So budgeting is both time budgeting and it's also financial budgeting. Right. So the coding toolbox, building and testing. So this is where this conversation gets a little specific to the FileMaker platform. So our main toolbox, what we do probably 95% of our work here, is on the Claris FileMaker platform. I think all of you are here because of Claris FileMaker. So the FileMaker platform is unique. It's unique in the sense that it has what I would call instant deployment. It is very easy to go to a layout, change the font, and save that layout, and it's instantly broadcast and deployed to every connected user. There's no deployment process. I don't need to roll my code. I don't need to use some sort of command line to build software and compile it and deal with runtime errors. No, Claris FileMaker doesn't have any of that. So it's a great all-in-one platform, but that does cause some challenges that traditional software development has tools for, and some of those challenges are on this list. So the main problem is preventing divergence, and what divergence means in this case is that if I have a copy of my FileMaker file that's my production copy, it's the version of my FileMaker app that all my users are using, and my dev team has created a dev server or a dev file, which is a copy of that file, a separate copy. Um, as as my users are using the production copy and my developers are developing on the development copy, the longer those two files stay apart, the greater the divergence. That means the bigger the changes are between those two files. And where that causes problems is simply like, if somebody makes a change in the production file, changes to the data or changes to a layout or a script or something, that is now not in the dev file. So those two paths have diverged, and that causes an issue because when you go get to your next deployment, and you deploy the dev copy as the new production copy, you might lose some data or you might lose some changes because of divergence. So divergence happens strictly from having a development pipeline, but it also happens if you have multiple developers as well. So FileMaker traditionally is a kind of one developer, one app platform where you're not going to have 4 or 5 developers developing on the same file all at the same time. But if you go to other platforms like JavaScript or Java or Objective-C apps or Swift apps or iOS apps or those types of things, it's very common to have a dev team of 10, 15, 20 developers all working on the same thing. And what they're doing is they're working on their own separate part that has their own separate source code, and then they're merging that back together. And this is basically what Git surrounds and manages. It manages all of those different diverging um, uh, branches, so that they can be put back together in one separate file. So FileMaker doesn't really diverge in that way, but it still has divergence. So in our coding and building tool, and also important for testing, is our acceptance criteria. I'll show this off in Trello in a second, but every card we create in Trello has acceptance criteria, which is basically a human readable description of what is it that we're building. Let's take print an invoice for an example. So acceptance criteria for printing an invoice might look at like create a button that says print, create a user action so that when they click that button, it goes to the print layout and prints that invoice. Create an error check to ensure that the invoice isn't already marked as paid. That type of stuff is your acceptance criteria. It's designed for both the developers to be able to build something very specific, but also for testing and review to say, yes, I can do this thing. Yes, I can do this thing. Yes, I can do this thing. So that's why it's called acceptance criteria, because basically we're not going to consider that thing done until we've been able to go through that checklist and show that that whatever function was developed can meet that acceptance. I mentioned a dev server already, but we have in our FileMaker hosting that we sell, we do sell a specific environment that's made up of 2 separate servers. a dev server and a production server, and that gives us a greater degree of separation and less risk because it allows us to make a lot of changes to a dev copy of the file. It allows us to do performance testing on a dev server where it's not going to affect the day-to-day users in on that production server. So we have that as part of our hosting environment. The Claris, they when they upgraded their licensing around version 17, they updated the license, the Teams license, so that your Teams license includes 3 servers actually, a license for 3 servers. So you can have a dev server, you can have a staging server, and you can have a production server. So that's where they came up with the number 3. But usually, FileMaker development again is going to get by with 2 servers, a dev server and a production server. Sometimes that's the same server. You have a dev file and a production file on the same server. But that comes with a little bit of risk. So like if you do something in your dev file that crashes your server, it's going to also crash the production server. So that's why it's important to think about having maybe a separate server for that. FileMaker has introduced very recently in their platform the ability to save as XML. This is different than a database design report, which some of you have used FM Perception. We've shown that off before. Um, a database design report is designed to be kind of like an inventory of everything your database does. Save as XML actually will save a copy of your FileMaker app as an XML file. And the eventual goal of this, it's not quite there yet because it's still relatively new, but the eventual goal is that I'll be able to take a chunk of XML and patch my FileMaker app as a deployment and add functionality or change functionality to an app. So FileMaker is eventually headed in the direction where we're going to be able to use stuff like Git and subversioning to be able to make changes to a database and track changes to a database. So save as XML is already there, but it's in its infancy now. So it's it's useful for maybe tracking information on what's changed, but it's not as useful for doing a restore or building something from scratch. And then for our testing, we do 3 kinds of testing. Starting, this is kind of in order of frequency. So most popular testing is white box testing, and what white box testing means is it's a developer that's testing that FileMaker app or that function. And that developer probably has some knowledge about how FileMaker works or how the script works or how it's supposed to work, so that when they test that, they have some knowledge about how it's supposed to work. The opposite of that, the inverse of that is black box testing. Black box testing would be something like me taking an app that I've developed and giving it to my wife and saying, "Hey, can you try this out and see what if anything doesn't work?" She has no idea how FileMaker works. She has no idea how the app works or what it's supposed to do. She's just going to poke around and see if anything breaks. That's black box testing. It's not having any insider knowledge. And then the last thing is unit testing, and this is the automated testing that when I said you should automate things. This is there is very robust unit testing available on other platforms. So for like the Vue.js apps that I build, I can build very specific unit tests saying like, go to this website, fill out this form, press this button. If it works, that's a good test. If it doesn't work, it's a bad test. And what unit testing allows you to do is repeat those tests over and over again. So when you start off a project, you might create 5 unit tests. But if you have a project that's been going on for 10 years, you might have 5,000 unit tests. And you can run those unit tests automatically each time when you build your software. Unfortunately, FileMaker isn't a great platform at all for unit testing. Really, the only unit testing you can do is very verbose custom unit testing by writing scripts. And maybe you have a script that runs a bunch of unit test scripts and it spits out a log somewhere. But that's highly customized and might not be the best use of time for FileMaker. FileMaker doesn't really have compiler failures. So you're never going to have a layout that just breaks because somebody misspelled a word on a field. That field might not show up right, or it might be broken. But there's other tools that we use for that sort of testing, like FM Perception. We'll read that database design report and we'll say, okay, there's the database design report found these 10 items. So unit testing in FileMaker is a bit different. It's not as automated as it might be in other platforms. All right, so toolboxes for your release and deployment parts of your life cycle. SVN, I mentioned this before. This is subversioning. Subversioning is basically about tracking changes to your builds. So each time I put a build together, it's going to say, okay, compared to the last build, this is what's changed. And again, in FileMaker, this might not be very easy to do. You can compare two database design reports and see what's changed between the two. But really what subversioning about is tracking your releases, tracking your build numbers. So most FileMaker apps don't have, they aren't in the habit of putting some sort of version number in there. I've seen some systems where I've logged into and maybe the developer in the footer has on the home screen has put a version number or a last updated by developers on this date thing. But for the most part, it's not so prevalent with FileMaker developers. But it's important that you track changes because if you don't track changes and you're trying to figure out when a feature was introduced. So let's say you want to go all the way back to before your invoicing module was put in the system. If you don't have subversioning, you can't really tell that. We get around that in FileMaker by making sure that our Trello documentation is really good. That becomes kind of our SVN, because basically we can see every card and the date that card moved into its approval state. So that becomes like these were the cards that were released on this date. All right, the other two tools we use, one is from Claris. This is the DMU, another acronym to throw at you, sorry. This is the DMU is the data migration utility. And what the data migration utility does is it's really slick. We were very happy when they released this, but basically I take my production copy of the file, the one that all the users are using, and I take an empty copy of my dev file, and then I run it through this utility, and it takes all of my data, all of my users, all of my settings and everything, and puts it into that empty dev copy, and that creates my new production file. So what this allows us to do is it allows us to work with a separate dev copy of the file and then deploy that dev copy when it's ready to go. And that gives us a completely separate development and testing environment, but also an easy process in order for us to make that the new production file and release it. So the utility we use a utility called Otto. It's a third-party wrapper for the data migration utility, but it allows us to automate it to the point where we're able to do a one-click deployment. And that basically says, okay, the dev file is ready. People are using the production file, but we want to deploy. So I'm able to go in there and click a button, and it will do all of the steps for me, so I don't have to worry about copying files or creating clones or using the command line syntax that the data migration utility has. And that makes that an automated and repeatable process. So if you go back to the beginning when I was talking about why use a development pipeline, this is the type of tool that automates that, and that gives us all of those benefits of security, making sure there's a fail-safe, making sure there's a backup, making sure that the deployment goes well. I get a report, I get an email that says this thing failed or this worked. And then it can become a regularly scheduled process where now we're automatically doing deployments, Friday evening every week at 7 p.m. So that's a really slick utility, and I'll show you that in a minute as well. So the last slide about Toolbox here. Not sure how we're doing on. Oh, well, I've been talking a long time. We're almost done though. So this is our toolbox for operating and monitoring. Now, some of the stuff you might be familiar with already, but a lot of this is stuff that you're building on your own. The first thing is a service desk and what's called a hot patch. So a hot patch is something where your deployment to production happened and somebody noticed like this thing is very broken and it needs to be fixed right away. So normally that isn't going to go back through a 2-week pipeline to order to fix that. It needs to be fixed, in the next 30 minutes, not in the next 14 days or 30 days. So at Mainspring, for our projects and for our clients, we offer a dedicated service desk. It's our answers desk. It's what we call it. It's just shoot us an email at answers@gomainspring.com and we'll take care of the rest. But a hot patch in FileMaker terms is or in any terms is a change that you're going to make directly to production. You're going to bypass all the dev stuff. But what's important to think about that is for every hot patch that you do, you're doubling your work because you're patching the production file, but you also have to make sure that that same patch makes it into the development copy. So in FileMaker, if you have a separate production and separate dev copy, yeah, it's twice the work. So you want to not have those things, which is why the pipeline for testing and the pipeline for reviewing and having meetings where we're demonstrating that these things work, all of that's very important for us. And we take that very seriously. And I'm happy to say that we don't have a ton of service desk tickets that are always opening up for hot patches because we've done our diligence with the pipeline. Next thing is a RMM utility, remote monitoring and management, I believe. Even I'm getting confused in the acronym, sorry. But what this is it's basically a server monitor. Now, we employ one of these RMM utilities for our FileMaker hosts, and they tell us if any servers are misbehaving. So like if the memory is getting overloaded, if the CPU cores are getting overloaded, if the disk space is critically running out of space, we'll get alerts for that. But that type of operation monitoring is what you want on your infrastructure. And that could be for your FileMaker Pro users as well. You could use an RMM utility to say this person has 19.4 and they need to upgrade to FileMaker 19.6. So that's the other benefit of that is it keeps people patched and up to date, keeps them secure, and that has a ton of IT benefit that has nothing to do with FileMaker at all. Next utility is just the plain FileMaker server logs. If we're doing a deep dive into some performance testing on a FileMaker server, FileMaker has a top call stats log that basically tracks every single thing communicating between the FileMaker server and everywhere else. So it gives us a very detailed log where you can say, hey, this thing that this one user is running is taking a very long time. We need to look at that process and figure it out and make it better. Transaction logging is something that is slowly becoming a native function in FileMaker, but it's something we've also built. You can build it into your systems, but this is for tracking changes to the record information itself. So this allows you to see, it allows you to track processes. Maybe you're tracking how long it takes to generate a report. Maybe you're tracking how long it takes to import a file or run some sort of API sync. Those can all be logged so that those logs can be reviewed by the operations team, the ops side of DevOps. Proactive alerts. This is again a custom thing you would build inside of your FileMaker files. A lot of us do error checking in our scripts. We say, if there was an error, tell the user, show custom dialog. There was an error, something happened. This API call didn't work, or this got 5 records instead of 1 record. each one of those places where you're doing that error checking is an opportunity for you to also create some proactive alerts. So you might want to send those alerts to uh, a queue somewhere where they can be reviewed. You might want to send them directly to the project manager saying, hey, this thing that was not supposed to happen happened, and we need to figure out why it happened and take care of it. All right. Another important tool for operations here is OIDC, Directory Authentication. Traditionally, the larger your users get, the harder it is to manage those users for their permissions in FileMaker. So FileMaker is natively works with a number of identity providers that offer like single sign-on, OAuth 2 authentication. This is like things like, sign in with my Microsoft account, that type of stuff. This makes it a lot easier to manage, if you've got 25, 50, 100 users in your system, it allows you to make one change in FileMaker. So maybe I'm adding an invoicing module and I need to make sure that the finance team has access to that invoice module. So rather than having to go and figure out updates for 25 different users, maybe I make one update and I say, okay, if they are in the finance group, they get access to this. So directory authentication makes it very easy for operations. And then that also usually opens up monitoring as well. That allows you to monitor where and when your users are logging in. If they're logging in from Switzerland and they shouldn't be logging in from Switzerland, maybe you have some security monitoring as well there that helps you manage things. All right, two more things. Backup plan, obviously, again, this comes standard with our hosting. We have a FileMaker server by default, comes with a 7-day rolling backup. So it keeps backups every night at midnight for the last 7 days. We take that one step further with our hosting, our FileMaker hosting. We back up that backups folder for 15 days of rolling retention at a separate location. So if the entire state of Florida is ever wiped off the map, we have a backup plan. Backup plans can go beyond that. You can back up each one of your builds. That auto deployment software I was talking about has that built in, and where it takes a backup before it does the migration. So you have a backup of both the dev file and the previous production file. Just in case something goes wrong, you have the opportunity to roll back. And then the last thing we use is we do some performance testing outside of everything I mentioned above. From performance testing, there's also some third-party utilities we can use for performance testing, specifically built around FileMaker. So I'll go over those. So in review, this is our pipeline. It's a never-ending cycle of starting with planning, going through development, going through deployment, and then monitoring that to eventually come back to plan more work. So if you're going around and around this infinity loop every 2 weeks, you're going to be building robust software. You're going to be releasing new features very quickly, and you're going to have all the benefits of that. So if you take anything out of this session, take this as a screenshot and say, what can I do along this path to automate things, to make things better, to communicate between different parties with the interest of getting those net gains out of all of it. All right, so let's do a very quick demo. Sorry, we're almost thinking this one's going the hour. So we'll finish up stuff here. So this is what our average Trello board looks like. Again, this is done in our agile life cycle. So a lot of you may be familiar with this already, but this is our pipeline here where we have our continuous improvement sprint here. But basically, it's designed to move top to bottom, left to right. And we start with the ideas, the epics. These are the big things we want to build, like the invoicing module, integration with Salesforce, integration with QuickBooks, mapping and routing module or something like that. So each one of those epics gets broken down into smaller cards, and they start from going cold to hot is the easiest way. So the more we plan those things, the more we know about it, and it can move into other columns. So the blue columns here, those are our planning life cycle. That's our planning pipeline, is to get things in the front burner. The greens are things that are in our coding, our deployment pipeline. Specifically, when things are in our sprint review, that's when the work is done. It's been tested. It is ready for deployment. Anything in sprint review is our release candidate work. It's ready to be released. And then after we release it, after it's approved, it goes here. Now we have some tracking here for our hot patches as well, our mainspring answers column. And we have a declined column, which this throws people for a loop usually. It's not that we got to sprint review and you said that's not working. Because again, we're going to go through the process of making sure everything is working before we review it with you. Declined is actually part of the planning phase, and it should probably actually be back here behind the freezer. But basically what declined means is like we plan this work, we went through the process of trying to plan this work, and then when we budgeted it and we are ready to forecast it, you told us that like, well, I really don't need an automated hold music jingle while this report is running. So I don't want to spend 5 hours on that. So let's decline to do the work on that. And that's what declined becomes for us. So this life cycle is all, it goes left to right. And maybe when we're reviewing something in the sprint review, somebody's going to raise their hand and say, hey, it would be really great if we also did this. And that becomes a new card back here in the freezer, and the life cycle starts over again. So this is Trello. Again, I was going to show you acceptance criteria. This is some acceptance criteria that we use when we're getting to know our clients. Do you have a name for the app that we're helping you build? Do you have logos and design resources? Each one of these things are what I call human readable things. Like a developer or a project manager or a client can look at this and say like, oh yeah, like I know exactly what you're asking for. So each one of our cards is going to have one of those acceptance criteria checklists to work on it. And then our hourly budgeting and forecasting are these little numbers that you see popping up here. So maybe we spend 13 hours on this. So we have 13 hours of work that's ready to be planned. Or maybe we have 2 hours in our to-do list. So we're only going to work in a 1 week sprint. All right. Flipping over to deployment software, I was telling you about like our one-click deployment. This is our what clients that sign up for our dev environment hosting that comes with 2 servers. This is part of what's included that we set up for them is this migrator file. And what this allows me to do is it maps out the files that are part of our deployment process, and eventually you get it down to a point where you're clicking this play button up here and you're doing just a quick deployment process. So this allows us to keep that separate dev file, allows us to deploy to production very easily. I can set up as many different jobs that I want to in terms of deployment. I can set up multiple files on this one thing. I can deploy the same file to 3 separate servers. So if for some reason I have the same file deployed in New York and London and Shanghai, I can deploy to all 3 of those locations from one file at the same time. It's a very good tool for being able to automate your deployments so that you have the security and benefits of dealing with your own isolated dev server. And this allows you to set up, multiple servers as well. So that is a product called Otto, which we have an agreement with them. We're kind of partnered with them so that we can offer that as part of our hosting platform. And then last thing here, before we take Q&A here, this is FM Bench. It's a utility that's used for FileMaker performance monitoring. It finds bottlenecks in your system. It finds techniques, basically creates a report and optimization. So we use this in some extreme cases where we're trying to solve performance problems. But there's utilities out here. Obviously, I didn't have enough time to go into more here, but the FileMaker community has addressed a lot of these concerns. So, all right, I shouldn't have closed that file. Let me see if I can open that up again. So, tip of the day. I know Marshall's big on tip of the day. I'll fit one in here for you. My tip of the day is multi-line commenting. So comments and scripts, you can create comments and scripts that basically tell you what to do. But if you didn't know, you can make multi-line comments as well. I'm hitting Option and Return when I'm doing this. So you can start creating your own in-script documentation. I believe it's Shift Return or Alt Return on a PC, but this allows you to do multi-line comments in your scripts. So that's the tip of the day here. I'm going to revert that, close that. All right. So we are on tip of the day Q&A. So if you have any questions, if you want to get started on a new project with us, hello@gomainspring.com. If you're already an existing client and you have service requests or you want to get restarted on something, answers@gomainspring.com. Marshall, are there many questions? Do you want to read off any?
There's nothing in the chat other than Thaleen asked that maybe we spell out some of the acronyms before we release this. And yeah, great job, Mike.
Yeah, I can update the slide deck before it goes out.
Perfect. What the heck else was I gonna say? I think that's it. Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts here, but once you get it down, it's not that complicated.
Yeah, and the important thing is you can break it down into each individual component. You don't have to think about every single thing all at once. So if you're already working on a project and you want to say, and you want to automate your deployments, you can add that. 3 months into your project, 3 years into your project, you can add that functionality on. It's all about setting up these things, these tools, these processes, so that you can get those benefits.
Right. Well, perfect. So we're going to keep rolling. Third Thursday of August will be our next one. And I think that I got a request from somebody to best practices on integrating with APIs into other systems. So Mike, I'll be talking. And like Claris always says, we can't confirm or deny any of the features will be in the next release, but we can't confirm or deny that will be the subject. But using FileMaker as an aggregator, then we're seeing more and more and more. So thanks, everybody. Have a great July, and we will see you in August. Thanks, Mike. Great job.